Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from our studio in Washington, D.C. So is the North American media fair when it covers the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And was our guest today fair in his critique of the North American media? We're joined by Sat Jali. He's a professor of communication at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, founder, executive director of the Media Education Foundation, and was the director and producer of the film Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land. So, first of all, thanks for joining us again. And to set the scene here, so you made the film Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land. You sold it to Radio Canada, which is the French arm of CBC, mostly in Quebec. They aired the film. There's a lot of critique of the film, is what some viewers and people who wrote letters calling it one-sided. And the Ombudsman for Radio Canada produced a report, this is a copy of it, and one of the headings in it was this propaganda? Was this PR? Was it one-sided? It calls a pro-Palestinian documentary or a work of propaganda. And the Ombudsman for Radio Canada sort of more or less concludes that this was a work of propaganda and Radio Canada shouldn't have shown it. So lead us through. What was her critique and what's your response?
Well, a major critique was that this was a one-sided pro-Palestinian film that had numerous inaccuracies that didn't meet the journalistic standards of CBC. And then she lists some of those those inaccuracies. But in fact, the way I want to use the critique is a case study of how anything that is critical of Israel is treated. And in fact, it's a case study of exactly what not to do when journalists are faced with this, which is to actually absolutely cave to the pressure.
Which you're saying the Ombudsman did.
The Ombudsman, it's a case study, and the film actually is about the media coverage, how the stories that are told around Israel-Palestine. But he also talks about when stories are told that don't conform to what is expected, that there is flack that comes from organized groups, organized pro-Israeli groups, that's meant to put pressure on journalists to make sure that the next time they toe the line. And in fact, and that's what the film predicts. The film predicts that if you have this kind of coverage, this is the kind of response you'll get, which is exactly what happened. The film was shown. There was an orchestrated response by two pro-Israeli groups.
Which ones?
HonestReportingCanada.com, which is an offshoot of David Horowitz's in the States.
And the Ombudsman says that most of the complaints came from
150 of those, which means that it's a coordinated letter writing campaign that comes as a result of an email going out. And then she says the only other complaints that came were from the Israel-Quebec Committee. So you have responses from two pro-Israel, Zionist right-wing groups critiquing the film, which is exactly what the film predicts.
Well, let's go through what the critique was. Now, the majority of this report is about one particular critique, which is the film was produced in 2003, 2004. It was shown in 2008, and by that time, Israeli settlers had left Gaza. But there's nowhere in the film or in RDI's Radio Canada setup for the film do they explain to anyone that the film was older and Gaza is no longer occupied by Israeli settlers, at least. So what do you make of that critique?
Well, history moves on. The film was made in 2004, and at that time, Gaza was directly occupied by Israel. But in fact, I don't think it's a real issue, because that's not the point of the film. The point of the film is not a history of the region. The point of the film is to look at media coverage of how the region, the stories of the region are told. And so I think a legitimate critique would have been, was the coverage of the Gaza withdrawal any different than the patterns that we had identified in the rest of, or in the
But certainly
previous.
this point, there's something to this point, that if somebody had watched the film and didn't know any context,
No, I think that
they might have thought there were still Israeli settlers there.
And I think that's the Radio Canada should have set it up better and said this was a film made in 2004. And although some things have changed, the way when I do the screenings of these films now, and I do a lot, history has moved on. And the way I present it is to say, okay, the film actually is about the media coverage, and it's about the patterns of media coverage. And so since then, history, whether it's the Gaza disengagement, so-called disengagement, whether it's the Lebanon war, whether it's the erection of the separation barrier, and more recently, whether it's about the Gaza assault. The film says something. The film says when these things happen, the stories that the American media tell will be structured in a certain way. And on that basis, the film is absolutely accurate in terms of predicting how the Gaza disengagement was covered, how the war on Lebanon was covered, how the wall is being covered, how the war on Gaza is being covered.
Let's show an example, because most of the report really is about this issue of the date and the fact that Gaza doesn't have settlers anymore. So people can make of what they were. CBC probably should have explained that in the beginning. But then the report moves into another segment which says, are the facts correct or not? And it picks up one particularly. There's a point that says the Israeli position is anything but defensive, and here's where that quote comes from. This is an interview with Husseini Bish.
Israel's basic posture is anything but defensive. Israel is the only country in the world right now which, in contravention to UN Security Council resolutions, maintains tens of thousands of heavily armed troops outside its borders in somebody else's country for the sole purpose of taking their land away from them, and in the process forcing them to live under the worst form of tyranny imaginable, which is a foreign military dictatorship.
So this clip kind of goes to the heart of the whole question of what's fair in covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If, for example, someone had shown someone in an interview saying Saddam Hussein was a dictator, no one would have expected, nor did anyone ever see anyone from the Ba'athist Party come on and start explaining that Saddam Hussein did whatever he did because it was necessary and justified it in some way. So I guess the contention you're making is, why do you have to do that when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well,
and specifically, this is the real question. Israel says what they do is defensive, and Ubish is saying it's not defensive.
Well, it really comes to the core of how you produce documentaries. I mean, and news, actually. In news and in documentaries, you have pundits giving their opinion all the time. And that's the way we use Husseini Bish in the film. It's not the narrator of the film saying, having an official line of the film. It's someone that we quote. If this is what the CBC says is an inaccuracy, then I would be willing to bet that 80 to 90% of what passes for news and news commentary on CBC itself is also inaccurate. Because that's what news is. That's what documentaries are. That's what journalism does. It allows people to say things. It allows people to express their point of view. And so to call this, it is an argument, certainly, but to call it inaccurate and the reason why the film should not be shown is, to me, just truly bizarre.
Well, the counter argument.
And if that was the case, if you could go through CBC Evening News and point to numerous examples where questionable generalizations are made by people who have a stake in what is being talked about.
Well, there's a lot of generalizations made about people we're supposed to not like Saddam Hussein. You never hear someone defending Saddam Hussein, or Ahmadinejad from Iran. There's assumptions made which are okay to make if they're about enemies, I suppose. But the counter-argument will be is that this idea that Israel is under siege, according to Israelis, that there are, particularly with Hamas, Israel makes the argument that Hamas refuses to recognize Israel in Hamas's constitution. The idea that the state of Israel should be eliminated exists. So this gives the construct for why this is defensive, and their argument would be none of that's in the film.
We look at the history of. If you look at the history of the Middle East, and you look at the history of Israel, you look at what happened in '68. You look at what happened in the first war in Lebanon in '82. You look at the second war in Lebanon. If you look at the aggressive power in those in history in that region in the last 20 years has been Israel. And you're really talking then about what Israel's position is. And I want to be clear, what we're talking about is Israel in the occupied territories. That is what the focus of the film is. We actually don't go beyond that very much. It's actually how are those, we look at 1967, in fact, as I think the key watershed mark, and how the occupation is treated. And in fact, to the extent that, how can the occupation be defined as defensive? Israel does. Israel says the occupation is defensive because we have to stop suicide bombers. We have to stop the violence creeping in. Well, if that's the case, then you have to look to see, well, what is the cause of the violence? What is the cause of suicide bombings? And again, you have to go back into history.
Which is what your film is about, is that American media in general, which is your focus, less Canadian media, but I don't know if it's that different a story, doesn't give that context. And when it reports in a one-sided way, you say.
It doesn't, and in fact, if you tell the story, as I said, from 2 days ago or 3 days ago, then it seems as though what Israel is doing is defensive. If you open up the frame, as you should do, to get a real historical context, then that will actually give you the true understanding of how to understand those historical events.
So to understand this process in the media, is part of the point here is that there's a rigor being asked for when it comes to stories about Israel that's never applied anywhere else.
Yes, I just think it happens at other times as well. I think it's an ideological filter. Again, when stories were coming out, if you go back to Saddam Hussein, when he became Hitler, the previous history of America's relationship to Saddam Hussein disappeared. And if that history was brought up, and in fact the facts that when Saddam was committing his most heinous acts, when he was launching chemical weapons against his own people, in fact he was a good puppet. He was supported by the U.S. It spoils that story, and you can't just frame him as this madman Hitler. You have to then look at it becomes a much more complicated story about the role of the U.S. and its relationship to the Middle East and its shifting relationship with the Middle East.
The final point in the Ombudsman report is that, and I'll read this section, repeatedly the document mentions the, quote, illegal, end quote, occupation of Palestinian territories by Israel. The legal reality is more complex, writes the Ombudsman. Jewish settlement and the construction of a security fence in the West Bank are without doubt illegal, but the experts do not agree on the illegal nature of all Israeli military presence in the West Bank because of the ambiguity in the English version of the United Nations Resolution 242 from 1967. Withdrawal must be made, quote, from territories, end quote. Is the Israeli withdrawal from the totality of territories mandatory or not under Resolution 242? The interpretation of this provision has never been clarified by the courts. So what do you make of that argument? That's sort of her most substantial critique of the film.
And it's the critique, or it's the point that's made by Zionist organizations all the time when it comes to 242. That 242 is recognized as the founding framework for what any peace settlement would be. And so it's this nitpicking, this legalistic nitpicking over whether the word "the" is in front of the territories. Again, the point I want to make is, she's using this argument that comes from the margins of this debate, because in fact it goes against the international understanding of what 242 is about, and she uses this as an example of how our film is inaccurate. And again, the point that we want to make is what she has done, and it's really a lazy report. I think I'm not sure she's naive, but it's really a lazy report in that she has bought the line of the complaints, and so she takes what the honestreporting.com, what the Israeli Quebec Committee says, and has used that as the framework for her own report.
And the significance of this is she, in the final conclusion, says that the film should never have been aired by by CBC, Radio Canada,
and the real significance,
which creates a precedent for any kind of films that take a position that seems to critique Israel on these issues.
And not only that, but the Ombudsman's report is also circulated widely within the CBC. And if you're a journalist within the CBC and you see this kind of report coming out, it is going to send a chill into reporting in the region in general. That's why I wouldn't really mind. I wouldn't be talking about it if it didn't have this broader perspective, because this actually now becomes a way that journalists at CBC are going to think about how they report the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is exactly what the complaints are meant to do. The complaints are meant to actually create that climate of fear that if you go outside the bounds of this kind of story, then you're going to get in trouble. And Radio Canada and this Ombudsman has validated that point of view.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take up the Ombudsman of CBC's recommendations. We're going to do what we think will be fair and balanced and interview the Ombudsman on this issue. So this is the report. You can find it on our website. You will also be able to find the response of Satjali, Here's a copy of it. You'll find a copy of that on our website, and you'll find a copy, a link to the film. You can watch the entire film there. And you could also, I would suggest, given that the Ombudsman seems to respond to letters, you could write the Ombudsman and suggest it would be a good thing to appear on The Real News and defend her report and take up this whole question of fairness in covering the Middle East. So her name is Julie Meville Deschamps, and you can write her at 1400 René Lévesque Boulevard East, room 2315. And we'll be calling Julie soon. And Julie, if you're watching, we hope to see you soon.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington, there's a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the Real News.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.